Yeah, that leads me to my segment, which is about the kind of private welfare states that exist in America. So Jen's example of what happened in Arkansas is really typical of the way that welfare in the United States has been under attack. And this has been happening for years. And as she rightly pointed out, this is because politicians don't want to be seen as actively fighting against these kinds of policies. And so creating these burdens are a way of undermining that while maintaining your, innocence or the perception that maybe you in part support them or you're on the fence and you're considering all sides. But in the US, a lot of people beyond the poor and working class rely on benefits that are granted by employers, and that too is being degraded or outright dissolved. Here's Jacob Hacker, political scientist and author of the book, The Great Risk Shift.
The United States is unique in the degree to which workers get their benefits through their job. In no other country did workers come to rely so much on their employers for their basic security. In fact, employers were like mini welfare states, right? Providing the kind of benefits that in other countries were provided by the public sector. So over the last generation, there's been this massive shift of economic risk from the broad shoulders of government and corporations onto the fragile backs of American families. And the result is that Americans are more and more worried about the American dream, about the idea that if you work hard, you'll be able to get ahead.
It's not that the US doesn't spend on benefits. If you combine public benefit systems with these mini welfare employer-funded benefit systems, we spend as much as other rich nations like Sweden on a similar package of benefits, but with very, very different results. The degradation of these mini welfare states is what Jacob Hacker has termed the Great Risk Shift. Rather than companies or the state shouldering the burden of risk has been privatized, with individuals and families having to personally manage and mitigate economic crises with no safety net. And every American is familiar with the disastrous results. Under the ACA, most employers have to provide or contribute some kind of healthcare plan to their employees, particularly full-time employees. But individuals have to figure out how to pay huge premiums, out-of-pocket fees, and continue to work while weathering health crises. This includes reading, as I said to Jen, 35 pages of legalese to figure out if your insurance plan has a deductible, what's covered, what co-insurance is, what co-pays you have to pay. Rather than the state providing all people health care regardless of employment status, individuals are forced to work in order to have access to expensive and often inadequate care. Here's how Erica Griffiths managed 4-stage breast cancer while continuing to work.
I tried to be as flexible as possible and I'd work from the couch, laying down sometimes, and conference calls. And when we first started chemo, it was all a whirlwind and happened very quickly. And I had talked to a bunch of different friends and friends of friends and just trying to get an idea of what to expect for chemo. And someone had told me, based on the drugs that I was getting, that after, like the day of chemo, I would feel fine. The next day I might feel a little bit tired, and then maybe like by the third day is when I would really start to feel the effects. So I kind of strategically was thinking, how can I do this where it wouldn't affect my job? So I decided on Thursday. And basically it was exactly that. Thursday I go to chemo, I'm there all day, I work, and then Friday, maybe like Friday night, I would start to get a little bit tired, and then Saturday was hell.
Like thousands of others, Erica worried about losing her job and benefits that were the difference between life and death. And she's not alone. One oncologist who was interviewed about that story said that 50% of the patients in her clinic continued to work while being treated for breast cancer with chemotherapy. The healthcare risk shift is responsible for millions of stories of personal suffering and loss. And more Americans are delaying care because of cost. As you can see in this graphic, over the last 3 years, the percentage of Americans putting off treatment for serious conditions has climbed to 25%, whereas in 2015 it was 19%. we've seen a slightly more modest increase in the amount of people who put off treatment for any condition, going from around 31% in 2015 to 33%. But we've seen that since 2001, that rate has risen for all Americans. And this is no surprise that it's much worse for Americans with lower incomes. Let's look at this graph that shows people delaying serious medical care because of cost by household income. And you can see that more people who earn less than $40,000 a year are putting off those costs, and that skyrocketed between 2017 and 2019. But it's the case that almost every earning bracket has seen these trends. Another critical side of the healthcare risk shift is that workers are encouraged to open health savings account, HSAs, or flexible spending accounts for healthcare and dependent care. These accounts are used to pay for qualifying healthcare or dependent care expenses. They use money from employees' paychecks to pay for this care. This benefit is supposed to be twofold. You have money saved for health expenses and the money is untaxed. However, if you have an FSA, not all the money you put in rolls over to the next year. So there's a risk here of an employee saving for health care expenses and losing the money if they don't spend it on qualified purchases. Also, lower earners may not have the option to save money for these expenses, particularly with 2/3 of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. This also means employers will expect employees to make do with worse plans because they can use the HSA or FSA to pay for increased expenses. And these kinds of programs are extremely popular with Republicans and Democrats, but Republicans have been championing to expand the remit of these programs so that they cover more things like ACH premiums on the Obamacare market. It's no wonder that medical expenses cause around 530,000 people to file for bankruptcy each year, according to one study. This was cited on CNBC, but it's also been used by Bernie Sanders to talk about the imperative need for universal coverage, because these medical expenses are wiping out the wealth and security of 500,000 families a year. Another key area of risk shift is retirement funds, as Jacob Hacker explains further in this video.
Most Americans had a defined benefit pension plan at their place of work. If they had a pension plan, it was one that guaranteed them a secure retirement income. Well, most of you probably don't even know what a defined benefit plan is. You've heard about 401ks and these other plans that are just like investment accounts that are run by your employer. Well, it used to be that you could get a plan that looked like Social Security, but it came from your employer, and that's no longer there. So more of the risk of retirement planning, more of the responsibility is on you.
So let's look at some of the data about retirement benefits in the US. This graph shows that roughly twice as many families have defined contribution plans versus defined benefit pensions. That's the difference between the 401k and a pension that guarantees you a certain amount of money rather than being subject to stock market fluctuations. But participation in pensions is more equal across education, race, and income groups. And you can see that on the graph, while participation in 401ks is extremely unequal in these groups. There's also a high share of high school graduates with pensions compared to the share of college graduates, 21% versus 24%. And the share of Black people with pensions, 20%, is almost as high as the share of white people with the similar plans. However, the participation gap for single women is wider for pensions than for defined contribution plans. What this means is essentially you can see the risk of retirement depending on which demographic you fall into, depending on your qualifications. With pension plans, it's more even across the board, but fewer employees have access to that kind of guaranteed benefit plan because they are not union employees, and private employers are switching largely to 401ks, particularly after the 1980s. Unions were a bulwark against the retirement risk shift. But with a weak labor movement in the US, more firms have turned to 401ks, which further drives inequality. We can see in the next graph that Despite rules intended to ensure that high-income families don't disproportionately benefit from the tax subsidies for retirement savings, savings-based retirement systems do not simply reflect, they also magnify inequality. The bottom 60% of working-age families receives 17% of total income, but holds 7% of retirement account balances. Meanwhile, the top 20% receives 63% of income, but holds 74% of retirement account balances. So the gap between the 1% and the 99%, the gap between the 80% and the 20% is even bigger when you look at retirement benefits. And that means that people, as they age, become more and more susceptible to other types of risk and economic shocks. We see this time and again. Jobs are less secure, even in higher paying positions. Hours are not guaranteed. Benefits are weak. Childcare is unaffordable, and two earners can barely scrape by. Mortgages have been acting as piggy banks for families, but the value of houses can swing wildly with very little protection for owners, as we saw with the Great Recession. Americans live with an incredible amount of insecurity and volatility, even those who are middle class or upper middle class. In this graphic, we can see the likelihood of a person having spent a year in poverty, on assistance, or unemployed. And we can see this gets higher as the person gets older, almost approaching an 80% chance by age 60. And privatizing risk explains a lot of this precarity and volatility within the lifespan of a person in America. In the second graph that I've pulled up, I'm sorry, it's a very graph-heavy segment that shows that people have a high chance, almost 70% chance, of spending time in the top 20% of earners, but they don't stay there. That class position is not fixed for people in America, and the risk and precarity they feel is felt across the board. So just as we see risk in terms of people entering into poverty, even when you enter into what should be a relatively economically stable position in the economy, you are not protected and it's not certain in any way whatsoever. There is very little in place to protect Americans from economic shocks, which can come from all manner of situations. There's also very little in place to make sure they can recover from those shocks. So people fend for themselves with piecemeal individual situations, like we'll see in this next video.
Aaron, his wife Celia, and their two children have lived in this parking lot outside of Seattle for the past 9 months.
When he has a day off, he will be in the front seat, and then the guinea pigs are at our feet.
These guinea pigs are therapy for their son Daniel, who is autistic and traumatized by the family's situation.
Before we got the guinea pigs, he was not very verbal. He didn't speak a lot.
It was very hard on Daniel. He and I were out here, and he said, "I hate this life and I hate you."
They ask us daily, when will we get a house? When will we get an apartment? How long are we going to stay here? And all we say, we don't know. We are trying our best, because we are trying our best.
But their best never seems to be good enough, in part because Aaron makes $17 an hour, often too much money to qualify for public housing assistance.
I reached a point where I really didn't see any hope for our situation.
That sense of hopelessness led Aaron to contemplate suicide as a way to give his family a better life.
I looked up what my likely Social Security death benefits for my children would be. Celia and the kids were asleep, and I tried to hang myself. And the belt didn't hold.
That video is just heart-wrenching. This is a man who works at the post office and commutes 2 hours a day by scooter and bus because he can't support his family on his income or qualify for benefits when he earns $17 an hour. So his family is homeless, taking care of an autistic child who is obviously traumatized as any child would be living in these circumstances. One thing that is a key takeaway from this video is that he contemplated suicide so that his kids could receive Social Security benefits. And as Jen said, Social Security is a popular universal program that almost every American will use during their life. It's one that guarantees benefits and one that the government administrates so it's easy to receive them. This is an example of a program where the government shares the risk so individuals can retire or so that their families can have income after their death. This became the only thing he could rely on to help support his family after being turned away from welfare benefits, after living in a country where a working person could not support their family on a single income. We need to take all of these benefits away from employers. In past shows, we've talked about why employers who constantly degrade these benefits don't want to have social insurance programs that are guaranteed and universal. Maybe it would be cheaper for employers not to have to provide healthcare benefits or pay into unemployment insurance. Maybe it would be cheaper for them to pay for these things through taxes that pool risk in a single system. But they're not going to give up that power over working people's lives. As Jacob Hacker shows in The Great Risk Shift, this precarity affects every American regardless of class and regardless of income. Only social programs that pool risk and guarantee benefits can turn the tide and lower how far people can fall.
I was just saying, I think that risk shift is a really compelling way of thinking about this issue. And I think you can see during the coronavirus, you can see it playing out in real time in a very compressed way, right? So at the beginning of the pandemic, the federal government was basically like completely absent, as were a lot of state governments. And you could sort of see risk being shifted to employers, right? So it was like, employers, like, should you close? Should you furlough or like lay off your employees? Like, it's up to you. And then
and
slowly,
they subsidized people's livelihoods and well-being through employment, again, because so many things are channeled through that. So the PPP loans were a way of making sure companies could continue to pay workers and kind of weather the storm, but you had to have a job.
Right. And I think, even before like the shutdowns started being mandated, it was kind of like, oh, like bars and restaurants, what do you think? Like gyms, so, there was a lot that was left in the hands of the employers. And then you could see the risk being shifted to the general population, where suddenly the rhetoric was like, everybody needs to wear a mask. Oh, did you go to a party? Like, did you see your grandma? Like you're doing this. And the whole time, I remember Bernie Sanders had pointed out, like, hey, we should use, like, the government should be manufacturing masks and sending them to people for free. Like, that's an example of the government taking the burden.
The CDC shouldn't put up a guide that says you can make a mask out of a coffee filter in an old sweatshirt,
right?
Which is what they did,
right?
It really, you see this over and over again too, where it's up to the people who are part of these failing systems. There's retrenchment on the government side, but there's something similar with the way that employers were meant to provide these benefits, where they're pulling back, they're making employees just be part-time to deny them benefits. They're using gig work, right? More and more ways of forcing precarity onto people who are working multiple jobs, have multiple earners per household. And with the pandemic, some of the CARES Act targeted exactly this shift that Jacob Hacker talks about. You could withdraw money from your 401k and it wouldn't be taxed. And that was a way to try to get people to balance the risk for themselves by withdrawing from their own retirement funds.
Right.
Right. Or rather than the government paying people's rent during the pandemic, you can take on debt. You're free to take on thousands of dollars in debt. You can't be evicted. And then the moratorium ends and what you have,
right. You owe like
debt.
Exactly.
Yes. And there are people who are, high earners who have so much debt that they have negative wealth. You see this over and over again. You see this with the narratives about, Trump supporters, many of whom are small business owners. They're not as down and out as they seem to be. But the way that they're responding to general precarity in the United States is the way that everybody is responding to it, right? They're saying, this has to be in my individual control. I can't rely on anybody else. We even see this with the way like pharmaceutical drugs are marketed in the US, where it's like, ask your doctor about such and such. And
Right.
then 2 seconds later, there's a lawsuit about it.
Mhm.
So you are left to mitigate the risks of what you consume for your own health as an individual,
Mhm.
because you can't necessarily rely on a job to provide you benefits if you get a chronic illness from taking a prescription drug that you saw for restless leg syndrome or something.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so it's this cycle that you kind of see at every single level. Even with childcare or with schools, open a savings account for your child so they can go to college. Open a FSA, which also covers dependent care. So you can open one of these employee-funded savings accounts to cover daycare costs. But if you don't use it, sorry,
Right.
the firm that brokered it keeps that money.
Right, exactly.